From beautiful East Tennessee in the foothills of the Smoky Mountains, you are listening to the Sherry Voluntary Show, and I do appreciate you spending your time with me. Today, my guest is someone I'm really excited about and I've learned a lot from, and that is Mr. Keith Preston. And he is an author, a professor, the managing editor of Attack the System, which is a great website, and an analyst for Press TV, and also a co-host a podcast called Kick the Puppy, which is a great name, by the way. So welcome to the show, Keith. Yeah, thanks. I know we tried to do this once before and had a technical issue, so I appreciate you coming back on and giving it another go. So your website, Attack the System, it says it's pan-anarchism against the state and pan-secessionism against the empire. Can you explain a little bit about what that means, what pan-anarchism is?
Pan-anarchism, yeah.
Pan-anarchism.
The idea is this. It goes back to a project that I started to develop about 20 years ago. I had been involved in radical left and left type anarchist and some libertarian groups for a number of years before that, probably about 10 years. And I started to notice over time how many different kinds of groups there were that were largely saying many of the same things. I mean, there were differences as well. And it was in a way that transcended a lot of the usual boundaries, a lot of the left, right, and liberal, conservative, and a lot of the cultural barriers as well. So the idea for the website was to create sort of a clearinghouse or an umbrella project where all of these kinds of ideas could be brought under an umbrella and discussed and dissected and debated and things like that. And so that's really the pan-anarchism idea. I was always interested in all the hyphenated types of anarchism. I became interested in that way back in the 1980s. And then the more I studied the idea of anarchism, I realized how many different types of anarchism there were. There were about as many types of anarchism as there were other philosophies put together. So I said, yeah, it would be interesting to have a project that brought all this under the same kind of roof and tried to discuss it as kind of an umbrella project. And pan-secessionism was an idea that was parallel to that in the sense that the idea behind pan-secessionism was about breaking down centralized systems of authority and control and domination through secession, so simply walking away from them. Now, a lot of people get confused about some of these ideas because, for example, some people think pan-secessionism is an ideology, and it's not. It's simply a tactical concept. I've had people say, well, what are the tenets of pan-secessionism? but there are not any. I mean, that's like saying what are the tenets of voting or signing a petition or, a revolution or something like that. It's a tactical idea. And also, they also tend to associate it solely with political secession, like the war between the states or the Scottish National Party or the Brexit or something like that. Well, that could certainly be under the umbrella of pan-secession, political secession. There's also economic secession and cultural secession and institutional secession. Like a lot of the traditional left-type anarchists have an idea of a general strike and that kind of stuff, which is the idea of an economic secession. Or a lot of the agorist types have the idea of counter-economics and dual power. And Murray Bookchin had the idea of dual power and that kind of stuff. And all of that kind of thing could be included under the pan-secession umbrella anyway. In the context of American political culture, people tend to associate secession with political secession, like the war between the states. And that term's not original to me. I actually got the term of pan-secession from someone I met in a chat room probably 15 years or so ago, something like that. So it's I took the idea and ran with it and developed it over time.
Sure, it's a cool idea. And so with pan-anarchism, is the idea to just have anarchists understand each other better so that they can actually work together? Or is it just, like you said, a clearinghouse where you just can see what's out there and what fits you? What's the idea behind that?
Both. There's multiple dimensions to that. The idea is to bring all these ideas out there where you can talk about them some more and understand what they are, and they can be debated, and people can decide which ones they like and they don't like. And we engage with other philosophies as well. We have people that contribute to our site or people that we engage in discussion with that aren't part of the anarchist milieu and have all kinds of contending views. So a lot of people in political circles, particularly nowadays, are really exclusionary. They're all about this little clique. Well, we're this and this and this, and we don't want anything to do with anybody that doesn't share our particular views. And I tend to take a much more opposite point of view, which is, we'll engage with anyone. I've spoken at gatherings, for example, of right-wing groups and left-wing groups and all of that kind of stuff, who had many views that I didn't agree with. But I'm willing to engage with anyone, whereas many people are not willing to do that.
Yeah, I've noticed in just culture in general, and it seems to come more from the left, but I do see it from the right as well, the left and right, where if you associate with someone who has a view that someone doesn't like, then you by default, just because you associated with that person in one instance, then if they see them as racist, then you're racist too, because you are hanging out with that person, or you spoke at an event that person spoke at. And I think that's just such a dangerous place to get to. And how are you ever going to reach out to people that are in those areas that you don't like if you don't actually speak with them or reach out in some way? So I sort of have that same view.
Yeah, well, it's interesting how that trajectory has evolved over time. Like when I first started out in radicalism, like decades ago, I think back then the right tended to be more exclusionary, because back then the right was more powerful and more influential, and they thought everyone that wasn't with them was a communist or something like that. And over time, I have seen the political right, certainly in the cultural realm, decline in terms of influence, and the left tends to be more in the ascendant, and now they tend to be the ones that tend to be more exclusionary and more about if you don't follow line X, whatever, we don't want anything to do with you. 30 years ago, I had people calling me a communist. Now I get called a fascist more frequently. So I did all that largely by standing in one place.
Right. Yeah. It happens all the time with me as well. I'll be called a libtard or, a conservative or something. And I'm neither one of those things. It's kind of funny when you see how people are so quick to label you as something just because you bring up, especially a lot with cop worship and just the hero worship of the military and the cops. And if you bring up even legitimate points, they don't even want to give you that, okay, so say they all are great guys, they're doing their jobs and it's hard, but this is a problem, and they don't even want to give an inch on that. They'd rather just kind of label you and stick you in a corner somewhere. And I think that's where I know we had spoken before about labels, and I am of the opinion that a label can be a good thing if it doesn't box people in. But what's your opinion on the kinds of labels that people use, say all the different types of anarchism, to put someone here or there? And
well, labels can have their place in the sense that they do denote certain kinds of ideas, but then you also have labels that become these very crude and caricatured stereotypes. And everybody does that to some degree. Everybody stereotypes somebody else to some degree in terms of what they think that person is likely to say. I tend to try to avoid that in the sense that I tend to, I certainly criticize all kinds of things, but I also am fairly open to hearing about other points of view about whatever topics that come up. I know you're on some of my social media forums, so you see I'll post all kinds of, and I've got all kinds of wild people on my comments threads and that kind of thing. And I never censor anybody. I never block anybody. I don't care what people say, no matter how outrageous or ridiculous it is. And that's really how it has to be if you want to have a discussion going. And if you've got a lot of people, I think, that take just the opposite point of view. They don't want to hear any other point of view. It's going to be our cool kids club. Only, like a friend of mine says, it's like the lunch tables. It's like the lunch tables in junior high school. It's like this group of cool kids who think they're cooler than everybody else, and this other group of cool kids over here.
Yeah. Yeah, I know that we always call it like the libertarian bubble in our libertarian circles, where people tend to close themselves off to other ideas, even within libertarianism. There's a wide variety of different kinds of libertarians, and so it's easy to do on social media because sometimes you just don't want to fight about it anymore. But I admire that. I've seen on your page a lot of times people get kind of nasty with you sometimes, and you always handle it really well. So
it's beyond nasty. I guess really malevolent in some instances. Yeah, but and that's one of the products of social media, though. I think one thing that's interesting about social media is that I think people are their true selves on a more frequent basis because they can hide behind avatars and fake names and stuff like that. And then they say things they would never say to someone's face or would never say in a public forum, say if they were on TV or something like that. But they can say what they want and lose all restraint while they're in a flame war with someone.
Yeah, kind of the psychology of masks where you can be a completely different person because, I mean, and some of these, like a sock account, they don't have any consequences for what they say or do because nobody knows who they are. So I think you're right, where people, face-to-face interaction is always the best. But, I've had a lot of success on social media as far as helping people understand new ideas or whatever, but it's a tough thing because there's so many distractions as well, and people I get distracted all the time. So I know you said that you had come from the radical left. So how did you get from that point to where you are now, and where would you say you are now?
Well, that's pretty complicated, but the interesting thing about that, when it comes to the left-right model of the political spectrum, most modern political philosophy is on the left. I mean, what a true conservative is a true conservative is a thrown and altar traditionalist. Like, so that's what conservatism originally meant. That was somebody who wanted to conserve the king, the church, the aristocracy against the rise of classical liberalism in the 18th and 19th century. So that was the original conservatism. Then when the 19th century liberal philosophy started to become dominant, that is a Republican form of government and basic constitutional rights and the market economy, the Industrial Revolution, capitalism, all of that, then that becomes identified with conservatism. And then the left becomes identified with reform liberalism and progressivism and socialism and social democracy and communism and varying degrees of extremes. So most modern political philosophy is on the left. It's just how far left are you, really? So most people, somebody that has the same ideas as the conservative Republicans today, 200 years ago, would have been on the far left. Sure. But I would say I'm more left than right in the sense that historically what that means is that the right tends to be more about stasis. It tends to be more about, well, let's not move too fast to change something. We might break something, or we might lose something, or we might undermine something that's valuable.
Our security.
I think that's a valid point of view. I mean, the people who think in this way aren't just being foolish. I mean, there's a dimension to that has its place. But the left tends to be more about critiquing established institutions and the systems of power and authority and things like that. Now, that doesn't mean that the left can't become the establishment once they become powerful. That's typically what happens.
Yeah.
If we look at all the revolutions that happened historically, that's what happened. I mean, you had the right got put out of power and the left became the new right. And I know when the Soviet Union was still in existence, I used to always hear the hardline communists described as conservatives, which they were in that system. The ones who wanted to preserve the Soviet empire and its satellite system, that was conservatism in that particular system. Where somebody that wanted to break some of that down was, on the left or whatever. So I would say certainly I'm on the more of a leftist than a rightist. I'd say a far leftist. I'm actually a very extreme leftist. When you break it down on the basis of topical issues, it's really hard to classify that kind of stuff as well. For example, I tend to be pro-Second Amendment, the right to bear arms and all of that. Right now, that's considered a far right-wing view in our culture, right? But historically, not. I mean, you can go back historically and find quotes from everybody from Malcolm X and Martin Luther King to Karl Marx to all kinds of people saying the right to bear arms is a good plan. I know Maoists and people like that who are for the Second Amendment. So it's so that's not really a left-right issue, or like secession. I mean, all around the world. In fact, I was just doing a podcast interview last night where we were talking about secession movements around the world, some of which are left and some of which are right, and some are far left and some are far right. And even a lot of the other issues that are really divisive in the mainstream society, like say immigration. That's considered, well, the left is pro-immigration, the right is anti-immigration.
Right.
Historically, it wasn't always like that. You can find plenty of labor leaders and civil rights leaders from the past that had a critical view of immigration. They thought it would suppress working class wages or the wages of domestic minorities and all of that. So what I think has happened in our own political culture in the United States is that more and more we're starting to see the culture fragment into all of these different tribes. On the one hand, we've got the rainbow culture, like the traditional WASP culture that was dominant for 200 years is breaking down and fading away.
Sure.
And now we have this new rainbow culture, which supposedly it's supposed to be about the equality for everyone, but in reality, it's becoming more just a wider collection of tribes, like it always was. And when you see that now with like how many Democrats are running for president nowadays, I mean, how many, like 200 or something like that, and they all represent little tribes. I mean, that's what they all represent, these little political and cultural tribes. And so I more and more I see modern societies, of the kind we're familiar with, fragmenting into these many, many different tribes. And I think the media and technology fuel that quite a bit.
Sure. I was listening to something you had, a lecture you had given or a speech somewhere, and you had talked about the religiousness of the left. And when I say the left, I mean in the context of what people would consider the left right now in this country. Mm-hmm. And how that has, I know in my mind, I think of conservatives more as religious, but when you said that, it makes a lot of sense because they have a lot of thou shalt nots and thou shalts. So do you think that that's kind of flipping what people would consider conservative and liberal? Do you think that's like ready to do another switch like liberal and progressive?
Well, I don't know if it's a switch, but I do think you can make the comparison. Like I said, when I first started out in radicalism, it was the 1980s, and Ronald Reagan was president, and the moral majority, the religious right, and groups like that were influential political groups. And you had the satanic panic. They thought you could hear subliminal satanic messages. We're probably not too far apart in terms of generationally, so you may remember some of this. And then there was the war on drugs and Nancy Reagan's Just Say No, and there were tons of things like that back then. I remember back in the 70s, you had people picketing adult bookstores for selling porn or things like that. Nowadays, it tends to be more the opposite. I don't see a whole lot of that kind of stuff coming from the right. Like I remember people blockading abortion clinics and that kind of stuff today. Nowadays, that kind of stuff does come more from the left. If you have somebody that's, say, a speaker on a university campus who is considered a fascist, usually they're just a center-right type, just a mainstream Republican or something like that. Somebody like Ben Shapiro or Ann Coulter or one of those people. And I'm not a fan of those people. But if one of those people shows up to give a lecture on a campus, these far left people will go out and riot and smash up the campus and the windows and that kind of stuff. Or you see that with the Confederate monuments. You see they go out and vandalize the Confederate monuments and all of that. To me, they're no different than the people I used to see throwing rocks at abortion clinics, or people picketing the adult bookstores, or picketing, a heavy metal rock concert because they're promoting Satanism or something like that. It's the same kind of psychology. In the sense that you have what amounts to a values community, what sociologists call a values community, and they see anything that's outside of that as threatening and alien. These people really think that someone like Ben Shapiro, a Jewish guy who wears a yarmulke, is actually a fascist. He's going to actually bring fascism to America or something like that. It's. Now, there are many criticisms I have of some of those people, but not the ones that they usually get the most hostility for. And you see that in many different areas. I think, for example, with the gay issue, you have it used to be you had the right that was obsessively anti-gay. The gays. I remember the televangelists used to talk about how the gays were putting subliminal messages in cartoons, kiddie cartoons, to turn kids gay or something like that. All right, and now everything is some sort of anti-gay conspiracy. I know, like the one of the candidates who's trying to run for president for the Democrats now, Tulsi Gabbard, since she's announced, her opponents have brought up, well, she was against gay rights 20 years ago, which actually she would have been in high school then, I think, or
Right.
or something like that. And her father was like a big anti-gay marriage crusader or something. It's like, so it's like blood by family,
Yeah.
blood libel or something. Blood is tainted by family association. So yeah, I mean, I think the reason for it is that the left, the cultural left at least, it tends to be in the ascendancy now. Whereas the cultural right tends to be more in a declining. Like most research that has been done in the area of religion, for example, shows that religion is losing its influence in the United States fairly rapidly, that more and more people are now identifying as atheist, agnostic, or simply religiously unaffiliated or indifferent to religion or whatever. And even the evangelical Protestant communities are leveling off in terms of their growth. They're not really growing. They're losing a lot of their younger people. The ones that remain are becoming more liberal. They're not as concerned about say gay rights or as like they used to be. They're just as likely to be worried about climate change or something like that. So it's. But what you do see is the ascendance of a cultural left that has this kind of same kind of moralistic crusading that they're interested in. And again, it's a lot of from a lot of similarities. One thing is the anti-smoking crusaders now, like they want to ban smoking everywhere, like in apartment buildings, and I mean that's straight out of the Mormons or something like that. It's. Or they want to regulate food, or of course the gun thing is a big one. That's the left's version of the war on drugs, or the liberals' version of the war on drugs. And there's a lot of other things like that. The Confederate flag, offensive symbols, racist language in some book written in the 19th century or something like that.
There's no idea that someone can redeem themselves unless they come completely to their point of view and basically have to apologize for every view they've ever held. I see this a lot with men and white people, where they will apologize for things they had nothing to do with, or apologize for other men's like this whole Gillette commercial thing. I thought it was, not everything they said was wrong necessarily, but it's just the kind of, we're going to try and sell you our product, we're going to beat you over the head with our morality, and, that men should step in. And I think we get a lot of mixed signals. I think men, especially in our society, get a lot of mixed signals about, well, you should step in when a woman is being harassed or whatever, but I thought you weren't supposed to white knight. Like there's all these different mixed signals, and I really think it's difficult. I mean, I find it difficult sometimes because of what you were saying about, you have a cultural, a now type idea of what things are, but you also have the historical context, and that might not match up. And it can be so difficult to translate your beliefs to people who, like if you say, well, I'm an anarchist, people have a wild idea of what that is. It's never voluntarism. It's never anything good. It's always Mad Max.
Anarchists, though.
Yeah. So
if you get 200 people who claim to be anarchists in a meeting hall and ask them to define anarchism, you're going to get 500 anarchists.
Exactly. That's what I always say about libertarianism too. There's so many, for me it's pretty simple, but for a lot of people, I guess it's a lot different. So now we talked a little bit about the left, and then I'd heard you mention something about the alt-right as well. And do you mean to tell me that the alt-right didn't start with Donald Trump and the MAGA hat guys?
No. The alt-right actually began about 10 years ago, and it grew out of the paleo-conservative movement. For those that aren't familiar with all the different factions of the political right, you've got the Republican Party, and then within that you've got the neoconservatives, which at least until Trump were the dominant faction.
Absolutely.
And that's most of the people that you see on Fox News.
Yes.
And then you have the corporate Republican types, the George Bushes and the Mitt Romneys and all of those kinds of people. And then you've got your more centrist Republicans like the Kasich types, and then you have the religious right, and you have the more right libertarian types, or Cato Institute and Rand Paul types. And then there was also the paleo conservatives, and this is these are conservatives that really have their roots back in the pre-World War II right. That is, they tended to be less internationalist. They're more isolationist in their foreign policy views, but they also tend. What's that?
Like Pat, I can't think of his name.
Pat Buchanan, yeah,
Yes, Pat
yeah,
Buchanan.
he's probably the most famous representative of this view. But they tend to be more isolationist in foreign policy. They tend to be more skeptical of free trade, like or at least what's called free trade, NAFTA and all that kind of stuff. Because the mainstream Republicans pushed that stuff to the limit, but at least they did until Trump came along. But the paleos were always opposed to that. They were more like economic nationalists, which is economic nationalism is just another word for mercantilism. That's really what that is. But they also tend to be probably more conservative than a lot of the neoconservatives are on a lot of social issues. Like they're less friendly towards immigration. They tend to be less friendly towards gays and all of that kind of stuff as well. So they tend to be one of the more conservative, socially conservative factions, but sort of an isolationist, economic nationalist type of perspective. So paleoconservatism reemerged in the 1990s at the end of the Cold War, because during the period of the Cold War, the whole American right tended to be united against the Soviet Union. There were exceptions, like there were libertarians that were anti-interventionists, like Murray Rothbard and people like that, but that was rare. Most people on the right were very anti-Soviet and therefore very hawkish on foreign policy, at least when it came to the Cold War. When the Soviet Union disappeared, these paleoconservatives started to reemerge. They started to say, okay, well, we got rid of the Soviet Union. We don't need interventions to do regime change and spread democracy and human rights in the Middle East and stuff like that. Whereas the neocons were all for that. So that was a big part of the split between the two. And then there were other issues as well, trade and social issues and all that. And so that's how paleoconservatism developed back in the early 1990s. About 10 years ago, the paleoconservatives started. The paleoconservatives tend to be older people. Like I know plenty of paleoconservatives, and most of them that I know were older people. And the alt-right started coming along, and they were mostly younger people that had been influenced by paleoconservatism, but they started taking it in a more harder right direction in some ways, but not in every way. For instance, they tended to be less religious. Like a lot of the older paleoconservatives were traditional Catholics and some of that, whereas a lot of the alt-right were atheists and pagans and Odinists and all this kind of stuff. They also made it more explicitly racial. The paleoconservatives tended to be civic nationalists, America for Americans, but if you're black or Hispanic or whatever, that's fine as long as you're an American. They were against mass immigration and illegal immigration and all that, but less race-centric per se, more civic nationalists. The alt-right, I think, started becoming more racial nationalists. And on one hand, it's interesting because the alt-right is also more left on some issues. They tend to be more left on some economic issues, like they're not as hostile to public health care, say, as the traditional conservatives are, or they're not even as anti-gay necessarily. I mean, they're openly gay people that are in the alt-right. So it's an interesting take on, they're not as Christian friendly, they're in fact, a lot of them think Christianity is a problem. They say, well, Christianity is what made our culture soft, and that's why we're being overrun by immigrants and Muslims or whatever. Yes.
Right. Yeah. It's really interesting because to me, I mean, as much as I don't like President Trump, I don't really see him as alt-right. Is he? I mean, that's what they call him, but it doesn't seem to match up to what I understand of him. So.
No. Trump is. Interestingly, I would say Trump is to the left of the normal Republican Party on many issues. He is basically the old-fashioned Rockefeller-style Republicans that we had back in the post-war period up through the Reagan era. Like, if you look at Eisenhower, Nixon, some of those people, that's what Trump is. He's certainly a business conservative. He's very much an establishmentarian, part of the elite. on social issues, he's far more centrist and pragmatic than the traditional conservatives are. He has no problem with gay marriage. You know, he's also somewhat more in favor of gun restrictions than a lot of the. I mean, he pandered. You know, he plays to the NRA and groups like that,
Right.
but that's obviously not his personal conviction. You know, he's clearly not personally religious. I mean, he plays to that as well. But he's,
Right.
you know, he's obviously. I mean, well, Nixon did the same thing. You know,
Yeah.
it was. What he's actually done is take the Republican Party, in my view. This is a controversial assessment, but I'd say he's moved it more towards the center. He's actually moved it further away from the right. You know, he's for example, when it comes to the foreign policy thing, the super hawkish Dick Cheney, Donald
Right.
Rumsfeld type that want war. He's moved the Republicans away from that. You know, he's moved the Republicans away from the free trade uber alles. On some issues, he's more like an economic nationalist, or like a protectionist, or labor protectionist, or a mercantilist. He's more willing to compromise on the social issues. I mean, probably the issue that Trump is the most far right on is immigration, but he's actually to the left of Eisenhower on immigration. I mean, if you want to see what immigration crackdowns really look like, go back and read up on Operation Wetback that took place back in the
Oh,
1950s.
jeez. Right.
Yeah.
Is that where they kicked out the Mexicans that they had previously made Americans and then kicked them back out? Okay.
Yeah. I mean, Trump is he's very mild even on the immigration issue compared to some of his predecessors. So yeah, I mean, he's arguably one of the most. I'd say, with the exception of Obama and maybe Jimmy Carter, Trump is probably the most liberal president the U.S. has ever had. You know, he's probably to the left of Bill Clinton, to the left of George W. Bush, to the left of Reagan, George H.W. Bush, all of those people. And he's more in the old-fashioned Nixon centrist, type of vein. And you see that in his foreign policy as well. I mean, Nixon's approach to foreign policy was interesting because he was considered a hardline anti-communist and a hawk, but he was actually the one that formulated détente with Russia and China and some of those places. And then he was also the one that withdrew the United States from Vietnam. And Trump is pursuing a somewhat similar, I mean, in a very, kind of, in a very, what's the term I'm looking for? I won't say inept, but
it's really disjointed.
Yeah, disjointed. That's the term. In a very disjointed way, I think Trump is reestablishing the old Nixon paradigm. The idea of, okay, we're going to have détente with the other major powers, and we want our hegemony or whatever, but we're not going to go but so far with that. And then he's pulling back in Syria and in Afghanistan and places like that. Well, what he's actually doing is just farming it out to mercenaries in Afghanistan and to Erdogan in Turkey and Syria. But he's still pulling back a bit from some of that. So I'd say he's a move to the left on all things considered over what the conventional Republicans typically are.
Would you say that tribalism plays a part in that move to either the right, left, or center? Where, I've known personally many conservatives that didn't like Trump when he was running. They liked like Huckabee, or they were more religious guy. And so, but once he became the Republican guy, they can't get enough of him. It's like he's their guy now, so they defend everything he does. So that, to me, seems like tribalism plays a big part in the move of people to other positions that they wouldn't have necessarily held.
Yeah, well, I think so. I think it's on the level of fans of sports team. It's like, all right, take somebody who's a fan of, the Redskins. They might say, well, I really wish they didn't have that quarterback. I wish they had kept the old quarterback or got a new quarterback. But they're still going to root for their team if their team's in the Super Bowl. It's like
maybe an ass, but he's our ass. Dang it.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. And what do you see that on the Democratic side as like I've heard some partisan Democrats say, vote blue no matter who.
Right.
So. And a lot of them think like that. But although I would also say that political debate is actually fairly narrowly constrained in our own political culture. For all this polarization, the realm of ideas is actually pretty small. For instance, this lady, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, she's considered the far left. And
Right.
one of the reasons why she's considered far left is she wants to have the graduated income taxes and all of that. Those are precisely the tax rates we had in the 1950s under President Eisenhower. So she wants to go back to the 50s, only on economic issues, whereas the right wants to go back to the Pat Buchanan types want to go back to the 50s on social issues when gays are in the closet, abortion's illegal and all of that kind of stuff. So you've got these, two wings of people who want to see how far back to the 50s they can go, I guess, and that's about it. That's the realm of debate. Interestingly, in most democratic countries that have a democratically elected government, it's not like that. In some countries that in Europe and Latin America and Asia, you can see authentic far right parties, nationalist, almost fascist parties that actually run candidates and win. The same is true of the left. You can have open socialists and communists that. Whether this is good or bad or not is debatable, but you do see a much wider range of opinions in most countries that have a democratically elected government. You can see, the Greens and in some of the European states, they have parties that actually have seats in parliament, like the Party of the Animals and the Feminist Party and the
Right. There's not a duopoly system where you just have two main power, sources, I guess, and they kind of control everything down from that. So I did want to ask you too a little bit before we run out of time. I know that kind of moving along to a different area, that you are on the board of the H.L. Mencken Society. Is that
H.L. Mencken Club? Yeah.
Club.
Yeah.
Okay. And I've not read any of his work, but I come across, quotes. I've read a couple of little excerpts of things that he wrote. But I mean, the guy was apparently brilliant, no doubt. And so what for you, what is his legacy like to you personally, and then also to, greater society? How could they benefit from reading his work?
Well, the H.L. Mencken Club is an academic society. It's not a political organization, and it's not just about Mencken. It's named after him because he was sort of an irreverent, attack conventional pieties type of person. And it's more of a paleo-conservative leaning academic society. Some libertarian, some traditional Catholics. There's a range of people that belong to it. But it's not just a Mencken commemoration society, is the point. But Mencken is somebody that's also hard to categorize within the framework of American politics, because on one hand he was very anti-authoritarian, but he was also very elitist at the same time. And he really had nothing nice to say about virtually anyone. If you go back and read his writings, he would attack conservatives of his time mercilessly and the left. For example, he organized religion, all kinds of things. He was an atheist who was also an anti-leftist, but not. He wasn't a conventional conservative. He had an outlook that is not very common in the United States, but it was sort of an elitist individualism. He was sort of in the tradition of Nietzsche and thinkers like Jose Ocasio, which is a tradition in European politics, kind of an aristocratic and individualist elitism, which is kind of alien to American culture. But Mencken was the son of a German immigrant, so he brought that cultural influence with him. He had some great quotes. Like he said that he used to refer to the South as the land of the Baptist and Methodist barbarians. He would
kind of true.
He said that when Roosevelt was in office, he said Roosevelt wanted to turn the government into a cow with 50 million teats that everyone's nursing from him. Let's see. You really have to get into his work and read some of his stuff to appreciate it. He was actually very opposed to democracy. He thought that democracy, and this is a European tradition that Americans aren't familiar with, but there's a tradition in European political thought that says, well, the problem with democracy, mass democracy, is that it doesn't uplift the common people and make them equal. It just lowers the superior down to their level.
Right.
That's kind of how he thought. He was an elitist in that sense. But he used to say that, the purpose of democracy is that to elect a drooling idiot president or something like that.
Right.
And
Sort of.
I'm sure if he was here today, he'd have some fairly choice things to say about a lot of the political. I can just imagine what he would do with our politics as it is now.
Yeah. It sounds sort of like Hamilton. Wasn't Hamilton was sort of that kind of elitist in his, I've heard him in his own life, he was like super impeccable and just had all of these.
Yeah, well, Mencken was far more irreverent, I think, than Hamilton. Hamilton was your typical. He was more like a conventional European aristocrat, although he wasn't really an aristocrat because he wasn't titled. But most of the founding fathers of the United States came from the socioeconomic layer that in Europe would have been considered the upper middle class at the time, meaning they were wealthy merchants and bankers and landowners, but they weren't titled. They weren't aristocrats in that sense, and they weren't royalty. And that's really in my view, that's what the American Revolution was. It was a class war between the upper middle class and the traditional elite in Britain. And then the French Revolution was something similar. But a lot of them brought that kind of influence with them. Hamilton, for example, was probably one of the most conservative of any of the American founders in that sense. He was, very elitist. He wanted to have a monarchy in the United States. He was opposed to the idea of a republic.
Right.
And, the Constitution is actually was a compromise between the more populist, the ones that wanted to keep the Articles of Confederation and the ones that wanted an American monarchy. So they settled for a Roman-style republic as the compromise.
Right. Interesting. So I wanted to move along a little bit to your books. I noticed on Attack the System, you had a book, and it was called Attack the System as well, but the subtitle was A New Anarchist Perspective for the 21st Century. And then you also had a book called The Failure of Anarchism. So I'm interested in can you describe those and maybe what is one more critical of the anarchist position? Or?
Well, the Failure of Anarchism is not an anti-anarchist book. It's more critiquing the state of anarchism as a movement or a philosophy and attacking a lot of anarchists, but not the philosophy itself. It's basically arguing that anarchists need a new direction, or they need to get their shit together, basically. And the Attack the System is a more elaborate work. And that's actually a collection of essays that were written over about a period of probably about 15 years. But it's creating a type of a new perspective on anarchism that's not the anarchism that came from the 19th century. It's influenced by that, Bakunin and Kropotkin and Proudhon. It's influenced by that. It doesn't shun that or renounce that or repudiate it. But it's not the mainstream anarchism today. Like when you see the people with the black masks and the Molotov cocktails just vandalizing a fire hydrant or something like that. All right, what that stuff comes out of is the 60s. It comes out of like 60s style radicalism. It's all about student protest, the protest model, or it comes out of the punk rock subculture. Let's just go out and smash something up or whatever. And you find serious political people in those tendencies as well. But that's really what's the dominant tendency among anarchists today. You still have some of the old 19th century anarchists, and then you have in the United States you have the anarcho-capitalists and all of that. But that point of view actually has very little influence outside the United States. That's a fairly distinctively American.
Has very little influence in the United States too.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Well, libertarianism generally has a fair amount of influence in the United States, but it's a fairly uniquely American movement. But what libertarianism is similar to was a branch of classical anarchism called individualist anarchism that actually evolved in the United States. Benjamin Tucker and people like that were associated with it. And Kropotkin, who was one of the classical anarchists, said that that individualist anarchism was very American because it was within this kind of liberal individualist tradition that you didn't find in the more communal societies, and that a lot of the other types of anarchism came from in Spain and Russia and Italy and places like that. What I was doing with those books, though, was critiquing the state of anarchism as it is and advocating for some new directions and things like that. And it's the same kind of ideas that you see on the website, Attack the System.
Right. So do you think that there's a place for Like I know many of my friends who are anarchists would say, well, I'm not working with commies or I'm not doing that. Do you think there's a place for bottom unity? I know a lot of people hate the ANCAPs because they say, well, you're not even anarchists. And so
Right.
there's all these, different factions, like you said. Is there such a thing as bottom unity, or would you encourage, I don't know if you've heard that term before, like,
Yeah. Yeah.
so.
Yeah. It's a matter of finding your lowest common denominator issues and
Mhm.
working around those. Yeah, I'm for that. Obviously, is to the degree that it's possible. It's interesting though because like I said, there's so many types of anarchism. It's like there's no consensus among anarchism on as to what anarchism is even is. Like you have some, probably the most common characteristics of anarchism is okay, we're against government. All right, but then you have some anarchists that aren't even focusing on government. They're more worried about corporations or employers, or some are more about the environment, or feminism, or some are more into veganism and all kinds of things. So it's I tend one of the idea of pan-anarchism that I talk about on the site and some of my books is more about. I've talked about the idea of building alliances, strategic alliances, and tactical alliances, and action around common issues and stuff like that. But it's more about building a wider intellectual paradigm. Like there was a Marxist thinker back in the early 20th century, an Italian named Antonio Gramsci, and he had the idea that before a political movement can be successful, it has to win the battle of ideas, and it has to essentially become ingrained in the culture. Otherwise, you can't really have a political revolution. The idea is that politics reflects the culture that it comes out of.
Right.
I think a solid case can be made for that. If you look at all the revolutions that ever happened, they were certainly influenced by the cultural milieu that they came from. Yeah. Like the tradition in Asia, for example, was always emperors and who were like deified as the sun god, and the guys like Kim Jong-un or Mao Zedong. That's basically what they were, a communist version of that. So the idea is there has to be a psychic sea change in terms of intellectual life and cultural life and that kind of stuff, and then that creates the cultural milieu in which the politics emerges from that. So that's more or less the point of view I'm coming from, and I have pan-anarchism is sort of a wider paradigmatic viewpoint. When my book Attack the System, the subtitle, as you said, is I don't remember what was the subtitle. It's
a new anarchist perspective for the 21st century.
Yeah, well, my original title was A New Anarchist Paradigm for the 21st Century. And my publisher said most people don't even know what that word means. So I need to change that. Yeah, okay. But there's another book by an English anarchist named Peter Marshall, a contemporary anarchist. But it's a very lengthy, elaborate history of libertarian thought, going all the way back to ancient Greece and ancient China and indigenous cultures and all kinds of things. And it's called Demanding the Impossible. But what he does is and he's an anarchist in the traditional left sense, the Kropotkin, Proudhon, Bakunin, that tradition. But what he does is he outlines the history of anti-authoritarian thinking, going back all the way back to ancient times. And he's got sections in there on John Locke and the Enlightenment. He's got sections on Nietzsche and all kinds and Christian millenarian and peasant movements in the Middle Ages and all kinds of stuff. And it's that kind of a paradigmatic outlook that I really promote. It's about it's more meta-politics than politics. I'd say that pan-anarchism is sort of like a meta-political concept. And pan-secessionism is sort of like a meta-tactical or meta-strategic concept. And then and I also talk about more conventional politics and stuff. Like, well, what does Trump's election represent? But that's not my focus.
Sure, great. So I really enjoy listening to your lectures and things or different talks you've given on YouTube. But do you have anything coming up that you're going to be speaking at? Where can people find you, or I know your website?
Let's see. Well, I do a lot of interviews just like this. In fact, just about every day now I'm being interviewed somewhere. But as far as upcoming speaking events, the only thing that I have scheduled so far for this year is the Mencken Club. I speak there just about every year because I'm on the board there. So I'll be speaking there this year. There's a tendency that I work with called National Anarchist Movement that has had conferences in Europe the last couple of years, one in Madrid, one in London. I'm not sure if there's going to be another one this year or not. If so, I'll probably be at that and be a speaker as well. But just watch, just keep up with Attack the System, the website, and anytime I have something like that coming up, I usually post it on that.
Yeah, that's great. I really do appreciate you coming on the show today, and I think for me, I don't know, I kind of look to you a lot of times to see what maybe a more level-headed view of certain things are within the anarchist movement, because I think that's kind of what we all need is, our goal as anarchists, I would say, is to get rid of the state and the force that, forces people to live whatever way. And a lot of times I think we all can get wrapped up in our certain brand of things instead of saying, well, okay, well, if we didn't have a state, though, we could all kind of live how we wanted, right? So I appreciate that kind of, academic look at the different points of view and not really picking a side and, going for your position. I mean, that's sort of what I do. I'm an anarcho-capitalist, and I think that's the best way, but I certainly don't think it's more virtuous, I guess, in some ways, except for, the amount of force that is not required to do that. So, but I do appreciate you coming on, and hopefully we can do it again sometime.
Likewise. Yeah.
Right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.